Hello, and welcome to module number 4 in the Sociology of Culture class. I hope you've submitted your first assignment before getting started on this module, because the content in this module won't be very helpful for you to get through that assignment. Because today we're moving from thinking about culture as things that artists produce, things that, artists and artistic organizations, art worlds, systems of cultural production produce discrete individual cultural objects. We're going to broaden our horizon and our definition of culture today to think about how culture shapes social life and society more generally. So, to do that, I'm going to introduce you to the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. He is a French sociologist and a central figure in sociological theory. We'll talk more about why that is shortly. Um, and we're going to be focusing in on his concept of cultural capital. And so this concept of his, which I'm saying that, and if we are taking the lessons from our previous classes seriously, we know that an idea or a popular idea or an influential idea isn't simply the product of one person. And we do know that Bourdieu had a lot of collaborators throughout his time as a sociologist and a sociological theorist. But nonetheless, when people refer to kind of Bourdieu's approach to thinking about culture or just his approach to theorizing society and social life, they do call it Bourdieusian. So people do kind of follow his lead in certain ways. And his influence extends up until today. People are still engaging with this concept of cultural capital in research. They're still extending it and critiquing it. So today, we're going to get a sense as to what Pierre Bourdieu meant by cultural capital, how he developed the concept, what it helps us see. And after covering kind of his contribution to the sociology of culture, in the second half of the module, we're going to look at how other sociologists have taken up his concept of cultural capital to shed light on other, or not other, but important sociological processes, things like socialization and social mobility. So, socialization involves things like child rearing and early education, and social mobility has to do with, say, getting a college degree and getting a job and moving through the socioeconomic classes, or as Bourdieu would put it, moving through social space. We'll have a better sense as to what he means by that by the end of today's module. So yeah, after going through those examples and showing how people have engaged with Bourdieu's cultural capital concept, after he introduced it into the sociological literature, I'll talk a little bit about assignment 2, which is very much just organized around the cultural capital concept. So once you get a sense as to what it is, you'll be able to get started on that assignment. And then I'll also say a little bit about the next 3 modules. Because for the 2 that have readings, there are no lectures, and then one of them will be a test. So I'll say a little bit more about those at the end and give you some guidelines, or not guidelines, but suggestions to orient your reading and your approach to preparing for the test. So to get started with the content for today, I'm going to throw over to a few graphs and play music that accompanies them. You'll see each of the graphs kind of represents one of the songs, and we'll listen to about a minute of each of the songs and try to kind of see what's going on there. Okay, so after listening to those snippets of these songs and looking at these graphs, what do we hear and what do we see? So first, let's kind of unpack these graphs and see, figure out what Bourdieu is trying to tell us. So we can see here each of the three graphs, there are occupational groups listed. So manual workers, all the way to, so are kind of at the lower socioeconomic spectrum here, through to medical social services, primary teachers, secondary teachers, higher education, art producers. I'm not exactly sure what he means by professions here. I'm sure this is kind of like a he conducted his studies in French in Paris, so this is probably some sort of translation thing. But nonetheless, we can kind of see the pattern that's going on here. So he's showing how those three songs that we listened to, they tend, and these are statistical analysis too, so nothing's absolute, but they're the preferences for those songs tend to crop up around or within different occupational groups. So he's showing how, the first track that we listened to, the first song, The Well-Tempered Clavier, was preferred by secondary teachers and higher education teachers, art producers. So kind of, we'll unpack this more later, but people who have higher cultural capital. The second one, Rhapsody in Blue, we can see it's kind of all over the place, but the first group that we identified who really like this song compared to the others don't like it to the same degree, and it's cropping up more around these technicians and manual workers, private sector executives and engineers. We see they're rising above here, the junior administrative executives. So we can see this kind of curve here. The Blue Danube, the last one we listened to, we see this one's the one that's most preferred by manual workers and junior administrative executives. So similar to this one here, as well as the craftsmen and the shopkeepers. So that's kind of a new group that's popping up. And we see the line goes the opposite way. So it's the least liked by the higher education. There's 0 people who like it in the survey, it seems. Or the percentage. And yeah, these are percentages. So who cares? Different people let's say cultural preferences tend to group up around occupational groups. Seems kind of obvious once you think about it, but sometimes sociological insights seem obvious, but they very much could have turned out the other way. Nonetheless, that's not important. There's 2 reasons why I wanted to show you this graph. The first one is that it provides us kind of one slice. We'll see how complex it gets shortly, but just one slice of Bourdieu's approach to understanding how cultural tastes are distributed among different groups in society, and how actually we can distinguish meaningful or important social groups by identifying their tastes, right? So people who have the same tastes may not all necessarily work in the same occupation, but if people all tend to kind of like the same things and dislike the same things, we can start to consider them some sort of social group, right? To be a social group, you don't need to know every other person who's in that same social group, but for the social group to even be one, it needs to be meaningful and it needs to have some sort of impact on social life. So Bourdieu would say that there are kind of taste communities or groups of people who are organized by their likes and dislikes. The second reason I wanted to show you this graph is because if you understand what's going on in this graph, I believe that you're going to have a better sense of Bourdieu's theory than many academics who have published on the topic, because it's just kind of a personal annoyance to me, and I've also just read a lot of Bourdieusian stuff and a lot of critiques of Bourdieusian theory. And one standard critique of Bourdieu is that he says, which this is not true, but this is the way that they pose this critique, but he says that people in higher socioeconomic classes, or who have parents and have a social background of, having inherited wealth and having access to kind of cultural authorities, right? Like we were talking about, people who have the capacity to judge and critique creative work. So the critique that people often say is that, so Bourdieu's conception of the world is that high status people, high class people have highbrow tastes. So they listen to classical music, and people who are in the lower socioeconomic classes, they listen to the lowbrow music. So maybe like rock, or or maybe they don't listen to music at all, or they have very weak music preferences or something. But specifically, people often say that like highbrow people listen to classical music, or high status people listen to classical music, low status people listen to, say, country music. And that's how they describe Bourdieu's argument to tear it apart and say, well, obviously that's not true, because because people who are in the lower socioeconomic classes do like classical music, and some have even like a deep connoisseurship of, say, things like opera. So that doesn't totally fit in Bourdieu's model. But as we see here on page 9 of the book in which he proposes the idea, he shows actually all groups like classical music. They just like different classical songs. And that leads me to kind of the second question I was asking about, what are the aesthetic differences we hear in those songs? Like, what are the musical qualities that were different across those songs? I can't be 100% sure that the people who filled out these surveys heard the songs exactly as we heard them as I played those clips. But for example, the first two were piano pieces. It was just one person at a piano playing the piece. And then the third one was more of an orchestral arrangement. Right? So maybe that's meaningful in terms of thinking about the difference between what Bourdieu would call legitimate culture and popular culture. But for me, as somebody who's, not a connoisseur of classical music or anything, they all kind of sounded different, but I honestly found like the well-tempered clavier and the blue Danube to probably sound very similar to my ears, in the sense of like, well, it sounds like classical music. It's interesting. But I didn't like, for me, those two were the most similar, whereas Rhapsody in Blue kind of had a bit of a, like a bluesy, jazzy vibe. And so that one stood out to me the most in terms of like music. But isn't that weird if we're thinking about how, if we're thinking about that kind of straw man argument against Bourdieusian theory, that people in like the higher socioeconomic classes prefer classical music, and then people in the lower socioeconomic classes don't. And like specifically, that's the other side of it too. It's not only that people have different preferences, is that people actively dislike the preferences of the other groups. And so this shows how that's a bit more complicated than these critics often make it out to be. Because people from distinct socioeconomic groups, or in this case, occupational groups, they're listening to classical music, but they prefer different songs. And so it's the meaning of the songs, or what they hear in the songs, that helps us to better understand their social origins, or their socioeconomic status. Whereas Bourdieu might say their position in social space. Okay, so let's get closer to understanding what Bourdieu means by positions in social space. We'll start by talking about Pierre Bourdieu as a sociological theorist, his contribution to sociology. Again, if you continue in a sociology degree and you take a more kind of formal sociological theory class, you'll definitely be dealing with Pierre Bourdieu for a week or so, and you'll have to read his work. I'll show you we're going to explore some samples of his writing shortly, which can be very dense and confusing. But he wrote it in that way to both to try to be clearer and also maybe more poetic. I don't know. It's a translation from French too, so French writing is often a lot more wordy. But anyway, nonetheless, he's such an important guy in sociology because he synthesized the theoretical canon of the science. So what does that mean? It means basically he took the ideas of Marx, Durkheim, and Weber and synthesized them in a really meaningful way. So if we're thinking back to the first module, when we talked about the reflection theory, so how does culture reflect the social world, and how is the social world reflected in the culture that we consume, or the popular culture of the day? And so he does a really interesting he does an interesting theoretical move in that he combines the materialist and functionalist approaches to explain where culture comes from, and the social skills that people develop that help them to interpret culture and kind of perform perform in social life that helps them to kind of achieve a kind of level of distinction in social life, or simply social skills that help them to get ahead in social life. So in some ways it's performing and showing a distinctiveness, and in other ways it's like skills that will help you get away and get ahead in life. And so he combines the materialist and functionalist approaches to do this. So it's still kind of that certain direction towards it's still that kind of material from as Griswold says, like from the earth to heaven causal direction. But he considers both the material arrangements and like the economy and the social arrangements and social institutions, and how those influence the culture that gets produced. But again, we're focusing, he has engaged his theory to explain those things, but today we're focusing on his kind of larger sociological theory in how that phenomenon, that kind of those sociological processes influence social life through cultural competencies. So we'll get a better sense as to what that means. So he links agency and structure and culture together. So people have more agency when they have more cultural capital, as he says. And structure is associated with culture in the sense that there are some he would say that in every society there are some cultural practices or cultural objects that are more legitimate than others. So that's one of his distinctions and types of culture, which is replicated in that first graph that I showed you, and we're going to see this a few times. But he would say to explain how to link agency and structure together, we need to understand culture, and he's identified 3 different types of culture. There's legitimate culture. This is kind of the authoritative culture that's relates back again to module 1 to what some people mean when they say culture in the definition of like the best that's been thought and known. So things that are seen to be the best, they've been awarded, they're critically acclaimed, that's like the legitimate culture. So things like classical music, opera, we can even think of like in our perspective today, we can even think of, say, like the Oscars, like movies that get Oscars have been legitimated, like they're consecrated culture. Whereas he distinguishes this legitimate culture from popular culture. So this is like economically profitable culture. So obviously there's some overlap in this, but we can just think of the highest, the most economically profitable culture from the most institutionally legitimated forms of culture. And so thinking back to the first graph that I showed you, where there's the difference between the occupational groups who prefer the well-tempered clavier from those who prefer the blue Danube. And I said, to my ears, those songs are both kind of classical I don't really hear that much of a difference. But Bourdieu would say actually what's going on, if we kind of look at the history of that song and how people have consumed it and where each of those songs appear in social life, the Blue Danube is like a popular classic song. So it's a song that's played often. You could hear it out in social life very regularly, so people are just inherently more familiar with it. It's kind of like every summer there's like one song you can't get away from. You hear it kind of in malls, or you hear it from people's cars and things like that. So in that sense, that's what he means by popular culture. Like there's compared to the well-tempered clavier, which is like maybe to hear that song you need to go to like a conservatory and like hear somebody play it. Whereas the other track, the Blue Danube or whatever, it's like it's a regular song that bands of the time would be playing, right? And you would hear it a lot. So those are two really important different types of culture that Bourdieu would differentiate to explain how agency and structure are connected. He would say that being more familiar and having more competency, understanding that legitimate culture would give you more agency, whereas to be kind of just go along with, like, say, the popular culture of the day, that would be to kind of fall more into the structure side. Like you would your cultural tastes wouldn't allow you to achieve social mobility or to change your social circumstances as much as in the case of the person who is more familiar and has more competency with legitimate culture. And I said that Bourdieu distinguishes between three different types of culture, and the third type is kind of the mushy middle ground. And so he refers to this using a bunch of different words or a bunch of different terms, but he calls it like generally we can refer to this as like middle brow taste. But basically it's in between popular and legitimate taste. So highbrow, middle brow, low brow. We can use that to distinguish them. But I think Bourdieu isn't using the word highbrow and lowbrow to refer to legitimate culture and popular culture respectively for an important reason. And I think that it's just clearer to know what he means. And I don't think this is just a personal academic opinion, but I just don't think thinking about like the brow line of culture is really all that helpful. And it's something that is constantly changing, right? We can think about how like just for example, like jazz music used to be a lowbrow genre or not associated with like legitimate culture, whereas today it's taught in university, and it is like a legitimate art form. But we can see even in the example the chart and listening to the song, the Rhapsody in Blue, it's got that kind of jazziness to it. It stands out. It's different than the classical music of the other two. So there's something special about it. And you can kind of see the aesthetic difference more clearly. But yeah, so those are the three different like zones of taste, as Bourdieu would call it: legitimate, middlebrow, and popular. And these are like three kind of spheres of culture, you could say. Okay, so by thinking about culture in those ways, he was able to synthesize the theoretical insights of Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. And when people say that like a study is Bourdieusian or they're taking a Bourdieusian approach, another way to say that is they're using field theory. So Bourdieu's approach to doing field theory has to do, so we can think about a field in the sense of like a plane. So an abstract social space. So we can think of even like a graph, right? So like an x and a y axis, and we can position people. Say if we're going to be doing sociology, they're going to be people or social groups, right? So we can position people or social groups in an abstract social space. So let's just like take a simple graph here, which is like the y-axis is inherited wealth, and the x-axis is level of schooling. Right? So we would imagine that inherited wealth and level of schooling, there's going to be a positive relationship. So, right, if we have the graph like, oh, wait, backwards. If we have the graph like this, people with a lot of inherited wealth are going to have a lot of schooling, and people with little inherited wealth are going to have less schooling. And then there's probably going to be like a arrow that, or the line's going to go that way. The regression, if you're familiar with that. But, you know, there's going to be a lot of different like points. So to see the pattern, you're going to have to like plot all those points and then do the math to like see what the regression line is. And so Bourdieu is constructing a theoretical abstract social space that's meaningful. And the way that he does that, right, is synthesizing these great insights of Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. And so by doing that, he comes up with, we'll see an example of this shortly, but the solution to this problem of coming up with a social space, like conceptualizing an abstract social space, he does it in a way that captures cultural distinctions which align around social cleavages. So in the way that like higher socioeconomic, like people in higher socioeconomic status groups tend to like or be more familiar with cultural, legitimate culture. We can see, not only see the social cleavages there, so like social inequality, or like, you know, the lines between different social classes, like socioeconomic classes, but we can also use those insights about these cultural preferences and tastes to understand how these social cleavages are maintained and how sometimes they change. Rarely, but sometimes they do. So even though the difference between, say, legitimate culture and popular culture doesn't change all that much, it does change, right? So that's important to consider. When we're using this field theoretic approach, we're both taking kind of like abstract snapshots of society, right? Where we're positioning people in different spaces and trying to see patterns or, like groupings that show like distinct social groups based on kind of implicit things that people aren't like saying out loud or know that they're doing explicitly, but like all tend to like the same thing and all tend to work in the same kind of line of work and stuff like that, right? And so it's possible to see through statistical analysis, but you can't really see it through just like being out in the world or talking to people. But so yeah, it's both it both provides the capacity to take that snapshot, but it also provides the capacity to explain how people move through social space. So we can think of kind of two ideal cases, right? Somebody is born into a poor family that doesn't have a lot of, like their mother and father doesn't have a lot of formal education or any formal education. Their professions don't tend to pay a lot, you know, but then you know, those that mother and father have a kid, that kid grows up, and then by the end of their life, they're like one of the richest people in the world. And then we can think of the other example. So that's like, you know, one example of like upward social mobility. Another example would be, you know, someone being born into a rich family with a lot of educational background and making a lot of money and working in a prestigious field of work. And then by the end of their life, you know, they're living like poor and desolate and like, so, and that's like downward social mobility. And so Bourdieu's approach helps us to understand how those things happen. How people move through social space in that sort of way. Typically, you know, things are not that extreme. It's usually kind of more moderate than that. But we can use his perspective to explain both extreme cases and more kind of moderate cases. Okay. So I keep saying I'm going to show you Bourdieu's approach to doing social space, and if you want to just like look ahead in the slideshows, you can. I'm not, because it's just like a pretty overwhelming graph at first. um, yeah, so one last thing just before we get into his kind of pictures of social space. We're thinking about, yeah, this is one way of boiling down his synthesis of the classical sociological canon, and that is to think about uh, resources that we use in social life. Like, um, Marx was very interested in capital, so money, assets, access to the means of production, right? So these are all forms of like economic capital. Um, and so Marx saw very clearly that when there are changes in the way that the system of production like works, or the like uh, like the output of the system of production, right? Like thinking about the Industrial Revolution, like how this change to the material basis of society, or what Marx would call the substructure, influences the superstructure, or like how we think about society, right? So anyway, um, so Bourdieu's not really arguing against that at all, but he's just saying there are other bases that shape, like there are other resources and things that can be exchanged or gained or accumulated, like economic capital, but they're not economic capital. So he distinguishes economic capital from social capital. So we can think of these as like relationships. This is like who you know. One of the most important forms of social capital has to do with like family. That's like the first circle of social capital, right? Um, and For example, some people are born into more connected families, right? So they're connected to, say, educational institutions, or big businesses, or whatever, right? So people have access to opportunities to get economic capital, and we'll see some other things here, through these social relationships. And then he distinguishes, yeah, and then the third type is cultural capital. So this is kind of the main concept we're going to be grappling with. We've been moving towards and grappling with, and will be grappling with throughout this module. So in the way that you can accumulate money, you can accumulate social contacts, like social capital. You can accumulate cultural competencies. So this has to do with like likes and dislikes, having materials that kind of exhibit a cultural, like exhibit your taste, or your, yeah, exhibit your taste. So we can think about somebody who displays like a real Picasso in their house versus somebody who just has like posters all over their wall, right? Like this is a distinction between, this is a display of something that someone has inside of themselves, right? This is a display of like, I have these experiences and this capacity to know that like um, uh, that like my space should be designed in a certain way, or whatever. But so I think tastes and then skills is the last kind of component of cultural capital. So it's a pretty messy concept. It's very kind of yeah, it's a messy concept. It means a lot of things, but hopefully we'll get our heads wrapped around it by the end of this module. So Bourdieu would say that there's three variants of cultural capital. I've kind of hit on all of them already, but there's embodied. That's like, yeah, your internalized kind of capacity. So like if you go to a museum and you're looking at a painting, like, do you have the capacity to like, yeah, what's your level of critiquing the painting? Is it like, I like the colors, or is it like, I like what they did with this brushstrokes technique, or is it like, within the history of art this means this, right? So these are like different embodied like exhibitions of embodied cultural capital. There's objectified, like I mentioned. These are like the actual objects that you own, or things that you can display. So and they display, yeah, they're like an objectified version of your cultural capital. Finally, there's institutionalized cultural capital. So in the way that like there's an embodied version of cultural capital, so there's like the performance and the actual doing of like interpreting a cultural object, um, or yeah, performing some sort of cultural skill. So this could be, yeah, like I mentioned, like interpreting a painting at different levels of criticism, or the capacity to like operate in a certain profession, right? So going to university is getting some kind of cultural capital, and you're getting a certificate that says like you've done these skills and you proved them at Lakehead University, right? So when you have your university degree, that is an example of institutionalized cultural capital. Um, and so the benefit of, or sort of, yeah, I kind of a distinct feature of institutionalized cultural capital is that it is explicit, right? So it's like, um, when you're in high school, people are saying like you need to go to university because people are looking at your resume and seeing if you did an undergraduate degree, or something like that, right? But uh, the other form of cultural capital, specifically embodied cultural capital, is much more subtle. So this has to do with like reading other people and being able to see like which type of person that they are based on their tastes, the way that they present themselves, and the skills that they like enact in social life. Okay, so hopefully that's more clear. We're gonna keep talking about cultural capital. So this it, hopefully we're kind of starting to wrap our heads around what cultural capital is. It's a lot of things. There are lots of different facets to it, but it has to do with performing a kind of connection to legitimate culture, and it helps you to get ahead in life. The last type of the last type of capital that Bourdieu outlines is called symbolic capital. I'm just gonna mention this now. It's not gonna figure hugely into the class. If you do continue again in sociology and are interested in Bourdieu, this is a central concept to his thought. So it's worth understanding, and it's worth just introducing here. But basically, symbolic capital is prestige. So by you can you can convert your social capital or cultural capital into, say, prestige. So for example, like somebody who uh yeah, it's hard to provide like a clear image of prestige because it's like it's a very subtle kind of social thing. But if you can think of any examples in your life where you've met somebody who's very prestigious, like what does that feel like, and how did you pick up on their prestigiousness? The A dumb example I have off the top of my mind though is like somebody who's you know, an acquaintance or in Beyonce's social circle, right? Like that person has prestige just because they're close to somebody who's you know, has a lot of social capital, economic capital, ties to maybe not like the Classical Music Academy, but nonetheless like uh, award granting institutions. Like she's a recognized like figure in popular music and stuff like that. So just simply being in the same social circle as somebody can provide prestige, or say thinking about different forms of institutionalized cultural capital. Like what's the difference between getting an undergraduate degree from Harvard versus another university, right? So just acknowledging, Bourdieu would acknowledge that prestige as well is a form of capital, and something that you can use that helps you to get ahead in life. But again, for the sake of this class and this module, we're focusing on cultural capital. Okay, so now that we've covered kind of Bourdieu's big picture contributions to sociology and boiled these down into his different forms of capital, we're going to explore his thought in a bit more detail. I'm going to show you the graph of social space, and we'll start to pick it apart. Okay, let's talk about capitals in social space. So like I said earlier, Bourdieu would use people's cultural preferences and their kind of their wealth to put them into social space, and we could think of that as kind of a snapshot of a snapshot of society or social space. So this is really hard to look at, and I can see how it might look like absolutely nothing at first. So let's take a little, I'll try to kind of guide you through it here. But we can think about, the graph that Bourdieu showed us earlier of the different, the preferences for different songs grouped by different occupational status groups. And so Bourdieu didn't just take people's musical preferences, or take data on people's musical preferences. He took data on their preferences for individual songs, for individual artists, artistic styles, and sometimes just kind of like vibes. Like we can see here, right in the middle, cozy is something. So preferences for coziness versus I don't know, other types. I think it's kind of like what kind of vibe are you going for in like your house, I guess, right? Like cozy versus like functional or sleek or something like that, right? So he collected preferences of their economic status and then like all of their preferences for different kind of cultural things. So books, music, art. Like I mentioned, we can see like there's artistic styles. So there's like the Impressionists here, where there's Renoir here. So the individual artist is kind of has a distinct reputation from the individual or from the group of Impressionists, which makes sense if you think about it. Okay. So yeah, there's still a lot going on here, but let me draw your attention to the x-axis. So on the left side, we have low minus economic capital. So low economic capital, but high cultural capital. So that means, people might not be making a lot of money. They might not have a lot of inherited wealth, but they do have a lot of cultural capital. So Bourdieu puts those people, so these people get categorized as higher ed teachers and artistic producers. So unfortunately, I find myself in this group as being highly educated, but not having a lot of money or having a lot of debt. Okay, but then as you move to the right side, we have groups and individuals with less cultural capital. So, less cultural capital in the sense of preferences that are closer in line with legitimate culture, right? So preferences that are closer in line with popular culture, but more economic capital. So people who make more money but aren't necessarily into the legitimate variants of classical music or all of this like highbrow cultural fare. Okay, so that's the x-axis. And then the y-axis is seniority in the bourgeoisie. So we can think of this as kind of inherited wealth. So people who have a long history of being wealthy and controlling the means of production, I guess, is technically the term, but so less seniority, more seniority at the top, more seniority, less seniority at the bottom. So we can think of that as like, remember the trajectory, right? So people who are have high seniority in the bourgeoisie, they've been like stably at the top of the socioeconomic kind of at the top of the structure of socioeconomic like the society's socioeconomic structure for like multiple generations, say, whereas the lower people finding themselves in this lower space here maybe are just finding themselves wealthy for the first time, or are coming from a family that like doesn't have a lot of inherited wealth or does not have intergenerational wealth. Okay, so this still remains confusing, I think, but one way of clarifying what we're seeing here is to look at our first example. So we can see the example of those songs cropping up here. And so they appear in very different areas of this social space. We see the blue Danube on the right. So that's in the category of having high economic capital but low cultural capital. On the Rhapsody in Blue here, on the bottom, in the kind of the bottom left quadrant there, So that's lower economic capital, but higher cultural capital. But we can see, it's kind of in this this spot here. So there's like, that means, higher economic capital than the people over here, but less cultural capital than them as well. And then finally on the left here, in the left upper quadrant, we have people who prefer the well-tempered clavier. So again, that's associated with legitimate culture. And the other thing that's kind of one of the things that's really hard to see here are the boxes. So these boxes, so this one, you can see here, commercial employers. So I think that what's interesting here is we're seeing kind of these occupational groups and how much variation they can hold, right? So this one has a lot of variation in terms of seniority in the bourgeoisie working as a commercial employer. So I imagine that's kind of like commercial manufacturing or things like that. And so there's a lot of variation there. So there's people who have kind of like owned the factories or been commercial employers for multiple generations, whereas those who are working in maybe lower ones that earn less money, and maybe they're just startups, maybe they're small businesses and haven't existed for multiple generations, things like that. So yeah, these different shapes, these triangles and squares demonstrate different occupational status groups. Oh yeah, also I think it's worth noting here the seniority in the bourgeoisie thing. Another way to pick this apart here, we can see this line age. This has to do with, right? So obviously if you're younger, you just have less time to develop cultural preferences and to make money. So this is kind of the line there from if you get access to the bourgeoisie, then end up over here. Okay, so what did I want to show next here? The other groups. Okay, so I think that maybe you'll find this interesting. I'm sure there are some of you out there who are considering becoming teachers in elementary and secondary schools. So in Paris, France, of I believe it was like the 1950s when the survey was taken. So we can see a kind of distinction here between secondary teachers and higher education teachers and artistic producers. And so, yeah, so we can see their preferences here kind of overlap to a certain degree, but there are certain things that are outside and distinct to these groups. And yeah, so we can see here that kind of unintuitively, or maybe intuitively, at least to me, the further you go into your education, there are opportunities for more there are more access, or yeah, they're just kind of like less economic opportunities, right? So there's kind of a bit more here, but this is a bit of a rare area, I would think, economically today. So yeah, anyway, worth considering how different professions line up in terms of like economic outcomes and cultural competencies. You don't necessarily, right? More education isn't inherently going to lead to more economic outcomes. There's a certain point in which that graph kind of drops off. We can see that that's kind of what we're seeing here, is that the more kind of cultural competencies that you get, the more you kind of resemble an artistic producer, which you can even think of as like a poor artist, right? Like the people who are over here, the people who are both like highly educated, maybe they have PhDs, and artists, they're both making the same amount of money. Okay, so yeah, right. This is like the snapshot of social space. And just to kind of this, hopefully, kind of, I'm just going to kind of keep simplifying here for a second. Bourdieu's approach to analyzing social space collapses all of these. That's why that chart is so confusing. But this chart kind of simplifies it a little bit. So let me just draw your attention to these two rows, the drinks and reading, because I think they're a bit more intuitive than the other ones. So we can see here on the on the left we have low brow, lower middle brow, upper middle brow, and high brow. So I can think about legitimate taste, right? Middle brow taste, and then popular taste. So in popular taste, we have people who drink beer and read comic books. And remember, yeah, this was published in 1949. But right, the kind of archetypes of highbrow, lowbrow still are with us. So yeah, people who are lowbrow tend to like beer and comic books. Moving up, we have bourbon, ginger ale, book club selections, mass circulation magazines, martinis, good nonfiction, some novels, better magazines, right? There's some sort of distinction here. And then in the legitimate highbrow culture, we have, um, good wine, adequate little wine, but, somebody who knows the difference between wines and magazines. Criticism of criticism. I think that's a good example of the type of like highbrow stuff. Like people are not only interested in the art themselves, they're interested in criticism, and they themselves want to critique the critiques, and they want to read critiques of critiques and things like that. Avant-garde literature. So these people are, interested in like classical and avant-garde, and they have the capacity to interpret these like dense and weird avant-garde things. So simplifying even more, unfortunately, it's not in the right order. Whoever took this picture, I wish they did it the other way. But again, in 1949, they had this sense of like, okay, there's these different social groups and socioeconomic classes who have these different cultural preferences. And we can see the highbrow, lowbrow, and then middlebrow. So, and I believe they're saying here, highbrows have the whip hand. It means that like highbrows have higher chances of getting ahead in life compared to the others, and that is Bourdieu's argument as well. And so yeah, this is kind of, we're back here with the three people looking at the paintings. We also have three social groups listening to music. Okay, so thinking beyond the snapshot, right? Like, how do people move through this social space, right? And again, remember, this isn't like literal social space. This is an abstract social space that's defined by your the composition of capital that you have. So economic capital, social capital, cultural capital. So how do you move through that space? Well, Bourdieu would say that one of the major principles through which people can achieve social mobility or stay at a higher social standing is to convert their cultural capital into economic capital and prestige. So so to convert cultural capital into other forms of capital, right? Bourdieu would say that your cultural capital has to align with legitimate taste or consecrated culture, right? And so there's a connection here to what we were talking about in the previous module when we were talking about Becker's understanding of art worlds and innovation, and in particular how changes to art worlds are also changes or also challenges to the power structures that maintain these art worlds. And so, yeah, that helps us to like clue us into how social power is wrapped up in culture. And so that leads us to this first point here, is that legitimate taste is defined by institutional arrangements that have like these authoritative interpretations. So, for example, the way that museums are the authoritative kind of places where art is displayed, in the way that people writing for like the New York Times review of books have authoritative interpretations, or certain movie critics, right, are seen as the like more authoritative voices in the critical scene. So legitimate taste is wrapped up with both the institutions that like continue to legitimate it. So these are universities, for example, that teach like classical music or film, things like that, and show and like teach people like by showing them like the greatest films and stuff, as well as institutions that like grant awards and institutions that support critics to make and disseminate their judgments. So there's power wrapped up in there, right? So thinking back again to why museums would have a stake in saying that outdoor art isn't real art. It isn't legitimate art. It's, you know, maybe a craft. We can think about arts and crafts and what's the difference between crafts and art? And it might very much have to do with being recognized by these powerful institutions and serving as a means of social distinction, right? So knowing things about art history and the paintings that are in a museum provide a form of social distinction that, say, knowing every lyric to Nickelback songs doesn't. Right? So nonetheless, Nickelback, I think, does win awards and stuff, so maybe they're consecrated in rock, controversial. Anyway, but you see what I'm saying, and this is what Bourdieu is trying to say, is that there's a form of social distinction that comes along with knowing and being very fluent in the cultural traditions and being able to interpret the cultural objects that are like legitimated by these powerful institutions, which include universities, museums, award granting institutions. These are like professional institutions, and things like that. And so that's, just to kind of recap, that's like its relationship to cultural capital, is that cultural capital is the types of cultural skills and preferences that allow you to convert things within this kind of frame of power and authority and social distinction. Okay, so let's talk about a few examples, right? I've already mentioned this, having cultural capital, cultural capital in the sense of a university education, right? I think let's talk about those three types of cultural capital that Bourdieu distinguishes, right? There's the institutionalized form, which is like the literal certificate that you can put on your resume that people will be like, oh, okay, I see that you jumped through this hoop. Sorry to be a bit glib, but yeah, you did the thing, and we can kind of expect that you have certain competencies. But the certificate is different than the actual competencies that you have, right? So your cultural capital isn't also, it's also the embodied version of your cultural capital is only partially depicted in your university education, right? So you both have the things that you learned and the professional skills that you gained, or professional kind of like schema of reference that you gained from doing your university education. But you also have cultural capital in the forms of preferences that you developed during your time growing up, right? Like the things that your parents introduced you to that you liked, or at least understand, and maybe you don't like, but you like have knowledge of things that their generation liked, or cultural preferences that you developed with your friends. All of those together can be converted into economic capital. But if we're thinking about, right, just the institutionalized form, that's your university education, and then the embodied form that has to do with like the actual like skills that you can perform and do and have inside of you. If we're gonna just like, I guess, talk about like the objectified form of cultural capital that kind of is related to this whole thing, we can think of maybe like some of the books that you would get from throughout your time in university. Obviously, like some textbooks and stuff are just gonna be resold, but you know, having certain books in the background of like a Zoom meeting, or having certain books in your office, right, that displays some sort of cultural competency. It doesn't matter whether you read them or not, but if people see like, oh wow, all of these books have to do with X, so this guy must know what he's talking about. You know, it's a performance of this cultural capital, and that's something that objectified cultural capital can do. But if you don't actually have the embodied skills to go along with it, people can typically read that pretty quickly. Okay, let's talk about another example of converting capitals into something else. Think about social capital. Some people say it's all about who you know, right? That's important in Hollywood. That's important in a lot of professions, to kind of get your foot in the door sometimes. And And so, yeah, how do we convert social capital into cultural capital or economic capital? Let's just talk about cultural capital. And I like the example here of Nepo babies. This is a really funny term that's been coming up. If you're not familiar with it, um, it's a very common phenomenon. I believe somebody, I'll look into it. It's coming to mind to me now that we're talking about it. But I believe somebody did one on, did kind of an investigation into the popular musicians, and he called it like the Silver Spoon Diaries. And so he kind of showed how a lot of the popular musicians of our day have parents in powerful positions in the music industry. Surprise, surprise. And so this is kind of what this Nepo baby concept captures. So this happens in different, I believe it's, I'm sure it can be applied to various industries, but I think it mostly comes up in terms of cultural industries. So things like the film industry in Hollywood or the popular music industry, right? So somebody's born into a family that already has deep connections into this industry, and what do you know? They succeed. And so typically people don't want to present this information right off the top because it just betrays like their own skills. But we can think of somebody like Maya Hawke, right? Like this is somebody who was born into a family. Ethan Hawke is her father, and so she has like connections into Hollywood. So, for example, just being born into that, this person wasn't destined to be on TV and to have a recording career and a career as a recording artist. But nonetheless, right? Like she grew up around actors and other people. I bet they live in like LA, right? So, and her father and I believe her mother too is very famous, and so it's like they have this huge social network, which she was just happened to be born into. And so, right, she can have like a casual conversation with famous actors and famous musicians, and she probably did just growing up as a kid, and that translates into cultural capital, right? So, as she and other Nepo babies grow up, they collect these little bits of wisdom, which help them to get ahead in their careers. Um, so yeah, that's an example there. I want to think a last example. I'm just going to throw this out to you. What can economic capital be converted into? I think that, right, like, could you buy friends? Could you buy social connections? What does it mean to convert economic capital into social capital? Or cultural capital. So like one clear example here is the money that you invest into your university degree. So that makes sense, right? So we can think about investing economic capital into cultural capital, but it's not purely, right? Like you're not just simply converting economic capital into cultural capital. Like you're not just like taking money and it's like, take that money away from me and now I have these cultural skills. There's also like attention and devotion that you need to like, yeah, there's attention that you need to commit and like time you need to commit to actually like transforming this economic capital into cultural capital. Again, yeah, like I mentioned, like could you transform economic capital into social capital, and how far does that go, right? Like what is a true friend versus somebody who is a business partner, or kind of like, yeah, you have a business relationship with somebody else. So how far does that social capital go? So that just helps us to kind of think about like there are different kind of qualities of social capital, um, in the same way that there are perhaps like in the same way that there are different forms of cultural capital. We can think of social capital along, say, like acquaintanceships versus close friends, versus business partners, things like that. So just to kind of summarize this, though, is that all these forms of capital can be converted into other ones. Some you can accumulate, and some you can like actually spend, right? Like so, economic capital you can spend. Cultural capital, kind of once you have it in the sense of the embodied sense, it's not totally like riding a bike, but I'm sure that like there's certain skills that are like that, like in terms of interpreting art and music. Converting social capital, right? Like these isn't something you spend. I guess you can burn bridges with people, right? Like some people can think of that phenomenon, right? Of somebody like using a social connection and then having a falling out afterwards because they're not like actually maintaining the social relationship. They're just trying to like extract things out of it. So we can think about that in the sense of like that's the conversion of social capital into something else. Depends on what it is. But those are other examples of conversion. So I just want to kind of hit on the aspect of Bourdieusian theory that it's conversion of capitals that helps you to move through social space. All right, so let's summarize. Let me just summarize some of the stuff I've been saying about cultural capital, and then we'll move on to a couple examples of studies that have used the cultural capital to explain things that are going on in social life. So, in the sense of your embodied cultural capital, right? In its embodied sense, your cultural capital is your tastes, not just your likes, but your dislikes. Your interpretive dispositions, some people are have stronger skills of interpreting, right, fiction or poetry or music or paint. Not everyone's good at all of those things, but to have some sort of passing capacity, right, in all of those means that you have cultural capital. That's in the sense of interpretive dispositions. And then it's skills as well. Like, so cultural capital can be ways of getting ahead in work as much as in like social life generally. And one way that cultural capital goes beyond like its embodied sense are these credentials, right? So these are certificates, not just university degrees, but other forms of credentials that prove that you have some sort of competency. Okay, so we'll do a little bit of an interlude, so feel free to take a little break, and then we'll come back. We'll do a little interlude. I'll show you some of Bourdieu's writing so that you can understand why I didn't assign any reading for this week and or for this module, and what you have to look forward to if you're going to be going ahead into sociological theory. And then we'll talk about a couple studies which have come out in the wake of Bourdieu's work, which engage with the concept of cultural capital to understand different outcomes in regard to child rearing or early socialization and getting out into the job market. All right, so before I present some empirical investigations of Bourdieu's ideas, so looking at his concepts in the real world, I just wanted to present some of his writing, some of his, so you get a sense of the flavor of his writing, because it is translated from French, and French writing does tend to be a bit wordy compared to English, but nonetheless, I think Bourdieu is known for being a wordy French writer. So even among the wordy writers, he's a wordy one. And sometimes he uses strange kind of phrases that collapse in on themselves that are both confusing and illuminating. So that's kind of an interesting contradiction of Bourdieu. So I got a couple quotes here I just wanted to share, just so that you can get a better sense as to what his writing is like. As we've been saying in relation to cultural capital, a part of your embodied cultural capital, right, is your taste. It's your likes and your dislikes. And he would say that taste, the things that you like and you dislike, your tastes, they classify, and they classify the classifier. And so, that kind of encapsulates his approach, is saying like the things that you like and the things that you dislike put you into a group, and I'm going to group you together with other people who like those same things and dislike those same things, and we're going to see kind of which social groups come out and which are meaningful. And for example, we see how some of those line up along like occupational status groups, and we could see other things in terms of like the background of like intergenerational background and things like that. Bourdieu is known for coming up with a lot of terms and concepts. So again, we're focusing on cultural capital here, but I feel like I should at least mention his concept of habitus. It's central to his system of thought, and it's again, yeah, we this isn't a concept that we're covering or like is central to the class, so you don't need to be familiar or have like mastery over the concept of habitus for this class. Focus more on cultural capital, but I just feel like it's worth noting just because it is a central concept to Bourdieu, and it does have some overlap with the embodied cultural capital. So it has to do with kind of your, that the word that this is close to is like habits. So he's kind of made up this word to talk about like people as how people's actions are grounded in habits that they've developed throughout their life that they're not necessarily aware of. And so I'll let you decide how clear his definition of habitus is by reading this quote. The conditionings associated with a particular class of conditions of existence produce habitus. Okay, let me say that again. The conditionings associated with a particular class of conditions of existence produce habitus. And habitus is systems of durable transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. That is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at our ends or an express mastery of the operations necessary in order to attain them. Okay, a little bit more. The habitus, a product of history, produces individual and collective practices, more history, in accordance with the schemes generated by history. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. But you can see how this is sort of confusing. And I think he's just kind of saying, like, your social context shapes the way that you're predisposed to act. And that happens at a collective scale, and it produces history. It both is produced by and produces history and social change, social life. So yeah, I'm out of breath from reading that, so maybe I need a break. But yeah, I hope that at least you've got a sense now as to what cultural capital means and how confusing Bourdieu's system of thought can be, but also how it can illuminate things that are going on in social life and how social inequality is maintained and how social distinctions how social distinctions can be grounded in different forms of cultural appreciation or different skills. So how do we get cultural capital? I've already kind of been talking about how you can get it at university in the forms of skills and degrees. But a really important component of Bourdieu's theory has to do with early socialization or early childhood kind of experiences. So socialization and socializing, these are two very different things. So socializing, right, is just kind of like talking with other people or being social, going out and talking to people. Socialization is kind of the thing, it's the process of learning how to be social. So how to adapt or how to know the norms and conventions of your social world. And these are generally learned through families and schools as institutions. Again, remember, one of Bourdieu's main contributions is being able to think both about material conditions and institutional arrangements at the same time. So combining that kind of Marxist and functionalist approach to think about how to think about like how people to think about people's lives and societies. And so Bourdieu and those who follow him focus on how families and early schooling as institutions produce patterned outcomes in pattern socialization outcomes. So that means like skills that children have once they've grown up, or like become adults. Yeah, so their capacity to kind of operate in the society that they grew up in. So that leads us to Annette Leroux. She is a sociologist who has done a lot of research on children and education, though this is a classic study of hers. To conduct the study, she did interviews with 88 parents and their children over the course of 2 years. So she followed up with them and kind of got a sense as to like, what are your, concerns as a parent, or like, what are your priorities, and getting stories and things like that. And then she also did 8 months of observation in 12 families' homes. So she saw, how parents were interacting with their children. And she also collected information, demographic information about these families and the parents that the families that she interviewed. So in the sense of their schooling background, their schooling background, their education, and their parents' education, their current income, their status, their occupational group, things like that. So she had all that information, did a bunch of interviews, observed families raising their children, basically, right? So doing this primary socialization thing, if you're going to draw on sociological jargon, or just child rearing, if you want to draw on a more kind of everyday term. And she found 2 styles of primary socialization that parents engaged in that broke down along lines of concerted cultivation and accomplishment of natural growth. So these are actually kind of pretty intuitive. Once I explain them, you'll probably, I'm sure you've heard either parents talk about them, or maybe this will kind of remind you of your own childhood or friends of yours when you were a child. So concerted cultivation is when parents enroll their children in organized activities for the specific purpose of transmitting life skills. So this means like always bringing them to soccer practice and then piano lessons and things like that. So often this falls on the shoulders of the mother of the family to do all of this work, which was a finding that Leroux found. But nonetheless, if somebody did take on those obligations and managed to do that for the kid, it led to a wider range of experience for them, and had certain outcomes, which we're going to explore shortly. The other approach to primary socialization was called accomplishment by natural growth. And so parents who followed this kind of child rearing philosophy, their understanding was like, as long as I provide basic necessities in the sense of like love and shelter and food, I just want to give my kid a childhood sort of thing. Like I don't want to give them too much to worry about. So this was kind of the 2 distinctive things. So, if just to kind of just draw a picture of this contrast, we can think of like the children growing up through concerted cultivation. They're always kind of going to lessons and formal activities, whereas kids who are doing the accomplishment of natural growth, they're just kind of like playing with their siblings or playing out in their neighborhood with other kids. And it's not as structured, right? Like maybe it's structured around like meal times, but it's not structured like, okay, you're, after school you have like all of this stuff to do. So again, cultural sociology more generally, we're not taking a normative approach. We're just observing these are 2 styles of child rearing, and they have different implications. And if we're going to use Bourdieu's theory, we want to talk about how these styles of primary socialization lead to different outcomes for cultural capital composition. So how much cultural capital do kids have when they go through primary socialization, defined as concerted cultivation, more than those who are raised through this accomplishment of natural growth. So for example, so they have more cultural capital because they're practicing, like, it's usually these activities are associated with like legitimate culture, right? Like I already mentioned, like piano lessons or professional sports and things like that. And so what Annette Leroux does that I think is really illuminating in the sense of cultural capital is show how through these different parenting styles and developing different stocks of cultural capital, the outcome is different senses of entitlement among these kids as they're getting older. And so I'm just going to go over to my PDF document and read through some of the article because I think it's a really clear example as to the difference of the different outcomes of child rearing and having cultural capital for outcomes for children. And in this example, what's going on is Annette Leroux, she's accompanying families. Like this is during her the observation period. And so she's contrasting these two different families, one that has a high degree of cultural capital and economic capital, we can say it, and practices this kind of concerted cultivation approach on their child, Alexander, versus the other family who has lower stocks of cultural capital and practices this accomplishment by natural growth to during the child rearing of Harold. And she shows us how these outcomes, how these different child rearing approaches and the family's different kind of stock of cultural capital shapes their interactions with doctors. So it shapes their experience of medical institutions. And just to kind of, even like before I get to the story too, like think about the outcome of that. If you're better able to interact with a medical institution, your health outcomes are likely going to be better. If you have trouble, communicating or even just feeling comfortable in this institutional setting, it's likely that your health outcomes are going to be less good. And right, like that's not a normative thing to feel uncomfortable in a healthcare institution, right? Like that's not again, I just wanted to kind of say that's not a normative thing. That's just like that's something that happens, and personally, I think it should be improved and better, and there are like clear ways of making that better. But as a social scientist, we're just investigating the process and trying to understand what's going on there. Okay. So I think that's enough of a caveat. Let's get over to the example. All right. So here we're looking at Annette Leroux's article, and I just want to go through her two examples of Alexander and Harold and their differing forms of entitlement in the doctor's office. So we'll just go through this. Alexander's mother, like many middle-class mothers, explicitly teaches her son to be an informed, assertive client in interactions with professionals. So, for example, as she drives Alexander to a routine doctor's appointment, she coaches him in the art of communicating effectively in a healthcare setting. Alexander asks if he needs to get any shots today at the doctor's. Mrs. Williams says he'll need to ask the doctor. As we enter Park Lane, so she's, following Alexander and his mother to the doctor's appointment. The mother says to her son, Alexander, you should be thinking of questions you might want to ask the doctor. You can ask him anything you want. Don't be shy. You can ask anything. So like prompting him to think ahead. Alexander thinks for a minute, then, I have some bumps under my arms from my deodorant. Really? You mean your new deodorant? Yes. Well, you should ask the doctor, right? Like the mother is kind of prompting him to practice communicating in these settings. Alexander learns he has the right to speak up and that he should prepare for the encounter with the person in a position of authority by gathering his thoughts in advance. And then she goes through the example here and shows how these are activated in the encounter with the doctor. And so, for example, and then so like in the example, the child is actually interacting with the doctor. So we don't need to go too much further into that. Now let's go into the other example. So for Annette Leroux, the opposite of entitlement is constraint, but I think for the sake of this class, we're just thinking of like different outcomes in the sense of entitlement. So we're looking at the McAllister family now, and how the fact that they don't have the same amount of cultural capital results in something different going on in the doctor's office. So between these parents, she observed, interactions that were more cautious and seemed more constrained. So here we go. Yeah. Harold's mother, normally boisterous and talkative at home, is quiet in the doctor's office. Unlike Mrs. Williams or Miss Williams, she seems wary of supplying the doctor with accurate information. The doctor asks, does he eat something each day, either fish, meat, or egg? I think he's thinking like protein. And then she responds a muffled yes. The doctor, attempting to make eye contact with the mother, but is unable to, asks, a yellow vegetable? Still no eye contact. Yeah. A green vegetable? Not all the time. And that Leroux notes that she hadn't actually seen the children eating any of these. So it just seems just kind of like saying yes to just kind of like get through this interaction. Right? So not really providing good information. There isn't the sign of like thinking ahead. The child isn't talking at all in this interaction. And so yeah, continuing. And then like this is a great example, or like a very clear example. And so the doctor throughout the interaction, at some point, then the doctor asks, when was the last time you had a tetanus shot? And she's just like, what's a tetanus shot? Just not familiar with this language, which, is not her fault or anything, but that's often a demand of the medical institutions and other institutions, that it's like, well, how do you not know this thing that nobody's ever taught you and is like this very complicated word, or right, this word we only use here, how dare you not know it? It's kind of how it feels in those situations. And there's an opposite kind of dynamic going on between the parents and the children in this interaction as well, where, in contrast to Miss Williams and Alexander, who she was like, prepare yourself to say something to the doctor. Whenever the Harold, the 8-year-old, in this case at the doctor's office, starts bringing things up, the mother is like shutting him down. So the doctor's asking, does he have any birthmarks? And she's like, no. And he says, yeah, I have one here, and tries to show it to him. And she's like trying to shut him up, basically. And so we can see how these different, the family, their different like composition of cultural capital shapes both, like Annette Leroux shows that, how their different composition of cultural capital is associated with these parenting styles, right? So these are just two examples to flesh this out. But she shows with, like statistics, or not statistics so much, but just kind of like demographic information, how these parenting styles kind of line up on different lines of cultural capital, which are associated with economic capital too, right? Because you can convert one into the other. But how cultural capital translates into these different parenting styles, which in turn translates into different senses of entitlement and shapes people's experience of social life and their interactions with others, especially others in positions of authority, right? Like that's an important aspect of Bourdieu's theory, is that cultural capital helps you to interact with people in positions of authority, like these doctors, and beyond that, to gain their favor. So I think that's going to lead us to our next example, which has to do with hiring practices and how people use cultural capital to get jobs and thus, get ahead in the labor market and in social life. All right. So the last study we're going to look at today is written by Lauren Riviera. And she introduces the concept of cultural matching to explain how people get jobs, how people get through the hiring process. And so she studied law firms, investment firms, and consulting firms. She did interviews with people like the hiring managers of these firms. So she did 120 interviews. And then she also did participant observation at a recruiting department for 9 months. So she actually like went and worked in a hiring/recruitment department of one of these firms. And she doesn't explain which one exactly. just to maintain confidentiality. But she's using the concept of cultural capital. So, right, we've been hitting on this throughout the class, that it has to do with credentials and skills and cultural tastes and interpretive skills, which people wield and use to convert into money and other outcomes, right? So you can take your cultural capital and get a job. And she's looking at that process. So how does cultural capital influence labor outcomes in the sense of, we've already talked about this, right? Like, so social mobility, so moving up in the abstract social space, right? So these aren't these are like abstract conceptualizations of society, right? That like higher economic groups, or people with more wealth are higher up, people with less wealth are lower, right? This isn't like literal. Sometimes it is, I guess. But just to kind of boil down social life and society into a field, like Bourdieu would do on a graph kind of thing. So how does cultural capital explain labor outcomes? So Lauren Riviera, zooming into this process, she talks about how people convert cultural capital into work, into jobs. And the first point I have here is meritocracy, right? So ideally how this would work is that the person who is best suited to the job is the one who has the best skill and the strongest credentials, right? But let's just let's just say, for example, there are two people who are the same candidate, they have the same skill and same kind of prestigiousness of their degree or whatever. How would a hiring manager pick between them? This is a very generous way of just starting what she found. So let's say that there's people who are exactly the same on their educational achievement and their experience in the job market. The way that a hiring manager would pick somebody is through what Lauren Riviera calls cultural matching. So this has to do with actually looking towards their similarities in extracurricular and leisure pursuits. So also the ways that they presented themselves, so like their style of dress. Hiring managers actually used that to judge the candidates. And so Lauren Riviera shows how these kinds of cultural similarities, so when they matched these preferences in terms of leisure and self-presentation, when job candidates matched those of the hiring candidates, they were more likely to get the job. So she digs through this. It gets pretty, she gets into the more kind of complex kind of ways that these hiring managers saw this. But ultimately, she shows how my hypothetical case, right, of these two perfectly the same standing in terms of skills and experience, how these people would be selected based on cultural matching. What she actually found was that actually the skills tend to be overshadowed by this matching of personal preferences. And I feel like this is really encapsulated by Lauren Riviera's research participant when he said, we're looking for someone who will fit in. So that was actually referring to how they would look at the section of somebody's resume that had to do with their personal, like their leisure interests. So like which sports were they into? And did that align with how this hiring manager thought of like the same, like, or, how did it align with their own leisure pursuits, which they typically understood as the same kind of interest as the organization in general. So the people who get hired tend to resemble the people who hire them. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, the way that they judge this is through kind of matching, cultural tastes. And so in that sense, cultural capital is something that is converted into a job by maybe you're kind of getting your foot in the door by having a degree. But the way that you're actually getting the job has to do with your personal preferences and things basically that you learned to appreciate during early socialization and while growing up. So yeah, just to kind of summarize, the way that hiring managers hired tend to look at people's like play styles more than their professional styles when they were kind of picking between candidates. And so that leads us to the end of this module. I hope that the concept of cultural capital is clearer in your mind than it was at the beginning of today's module. If it still does remain confusing, I do understand that, and I'm happy to chat more with how this concept can be engaged. Because if things do remain confusing, please do reach out to me or take a closer look at if revisiting parts of the lecture aren't helpful, feel free to get in touch, because having a solid understanding of the cultural capital concept, which again we've seen there are like lots of different dimensions of it. It has to do with growing up, it has to do with finding work, it has to do with taste, because I was just saying that having a good sense as to what cultural capital means is going to be important for the second assignment. Because I'm asking you to make a meme about it. So I'll get into some details there in terms of the second assignment. And then I'll talk about the next 3 modules before closing out today's video lecture. Okay, so assignment 2 is to make a meme about cultural capital and to write a description of it. Surprisingly, I Googled, cultural capital memes, and I didn't find very many. I did find this one on the left. One does not simply acquire cultural capital, right? And I made the one on the right. So it's like, this one's kind of a joke. Like I was about how having more and more cultural capital and achieving higher levels of economic credentials doesn't necessarily translate into economic outcomes. And so, in the meme that you create, it doesn't have to deal with every single aspect of cultural capital, but it does need to kind of illustrate an understanding of it. So, you might want to focus on the child rearing or the socialization aspect of cultural capital. You might want to focus on cultural matching, or some other kind of conversion thing or something else. Feel free to use your imagination. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with. So, so importantly, understanding what cultural capital is and kind of brainstorming for a while to come up with something that works. You're not being graded on how funny your meme is, or how innovative it is. I do hope that you stay within the conventions of memes. We don't need to innovate the memes themselves. It's more about showing that you understand cultural capital and you can kind of like do something with that idea, right? So that's sort of my philosophy with this assignment, is that you can't really make a joke about something, or you can't make fun of it, or you can't kind of play with it without understanding it. So understanding cultural capital is going to be necessary to do this assignment. And I hope that you find it like a fun, creative activity to kind of practice applying the concept of cultural capital in a kind of funky way. So take a look over the instructions. I've tried to outline the steps as clearly as possible. And the evaluation criteria are the same as the previous assignment. So any questions there, feel free to send them along or post them in the discussion thread. Okay. The next 3 modules. So module number 6 is a test, and that's covering modules 1 through 3. So nothing in this module for the test. That's all the introduction stuff. So early, the other sociological theory stuff, not cultural capital and Bourdieu. and then the collaborative circle theory and the module on art worlds and cultural production. So be sure to be familiar with the content and the theories and the concepts there. And you'll have a few days to take the time to do that test. Module number 5 and 7 are reading modules. So you'll just read these articles and then complete the reading test. So just to provide maybe some guidance, orienting comments for approaching these readings. The Lizardo and Skiles article summarizes research on taste and cultural consumption, basically since Bourdieu. So they cover the concept of cultural consecration, which we hit on in today's lecture. It has to do, it's very much wrapped up in the concept of legitimate culture. So cultural consecration is what these institutions do to legitimate the culture, or like bestow prestige or recognize culture and kind of bring it into legitimate culture, you could say, right? So this has to do with if like a certain composer or artistic tradition is taught in like university classes, right? So thinking about like Bach and Beethoven and the Impressionists, right? Like they're consecrated for one reason, because they're taught regularly in university classes. But cultural consecration is also done through like giving awards and things like that. So awards also bestow cultural consecration. And then also watch out for the concept of omnivorousness or omnivorism. It's a type of consumption. So it's like thinking about taste and cultural capital. Omnivorousness is like a taste profile. So it's kind of a person, like the extreme version of this is like somebody who likes everything and is both well versed in highbrow culture and popular culture. But you'll read more about that from Lizardo and Skiles. And there's the test. And then module number 7 is Rick Moore's article, Fast or Slow, where he engages with what we call dual process models. So how people think, to study the difference between religious groups and atheists. And it's a really interesting paper, really sophisticated research methods. So just to kind of heads up, I don't expect you to understand every single thing or like to understand the things that he's citing, but I just want you to figure out what's his main argument, like what's the thing that he's trying to say about, what's the central kind of claim he's advancing in the article, and what are the pieces of evidence that he's using to make that claim. And do you find those convincing? Which ones do you find stronger? Which ones do you find weaker? So think about that as you're reading the article. Yeah, don't like take as much time on that article as you would on, say, watching a lecture or doing one of the other readings. Just like, I'm just saying that because it can be really demanding, and you might find yourself being like, oh, I need to go look up this source because I don't understand what he's saying. Try to do without that. Try to kind of get all the information you can out of the article itself. You might want to, maybe look if he's referring to certain like religious groups, and you find that he doesn't do a great job of like explaining like what's the deal with that religious group, like why are they different than another one. Maybe just like look that up on Wikipedia. But beyond that, try to just like get through the article, try to figure out what his main thing is, and find a couple pieces of evidence that he uses to make that claim. And think about how strong or weak those pieces of evidence are. Great. And so with that, we are at the end of this module. So I'll wish you the best with the rest of your day, with the rest of this week, while completing these readings and this test. And I will see you in the lecture for module 8. Take care.